Sure. Brooke, do you want to, I know you're not on video. I don't know if you're able to say a few words about Middle Mile. I don't know if you and the NTIA want to say anything first, and then we can add in. Looks like Brooke might be in listening mode.
I love how we're always just throwing Brooke right under the bus when she's not ready to talk.
Come on in, Brooke.
I am so excited. Well, let me just pull up some of the numbers.
Yeah.
We are so excited that Maine has received its $30 million Middle Mile grant. So this is part of a $930 million NTIA program. And it was extremely competitive. Let me see if I have the numbers here about how many applied.
Yeah, I do, Brooke, just because we were watching so closely. They expected it to be about $1 billion that they were going to allocate, and there were over $7.5 billion worth of requests.
Which is incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, 260 applications. So Maine you all should be very proud about your application. Very proud about the award. It's also, I was looking at the list of the other awardees today, across 34 states, I think. Yeah. And Maine is one of the only ones where the grant went directly to the state or a state entity. A lot of these were going to private ISPs to build out networks. So it's really exciting. You know, this is open access. It's going to some of the most sparsely populated and least served areas of the state. And, you know, it's great on its own, but it also is going to allow MCA to stretch the BEAD dollars that much further. It's really an exciting public-private partnership. So I'll let the MCA team fill in more of the details, but from the NTIA perspective, we're very, very proud to be funding this project.
Yeah, thank you, Brooke. We could not be happier. We have seen this as a really important strategic piece of the puzzle. And for folks that are not super versed on sort of the behind the scenes piece, the Middle Mile is not going to bring fiber to anyone's home. It is going to enable the last mile connections to become easier and more affordable, because it essentially allows those last mile providers to have a more affordable option and a better connection. We are going to, the $30 million grant that we will receive from NTIA, because this proposal has been funded, is part of a $53 million project, which is going to fund 530 miles of middle mile infrastructure, which is going to serve a tremendous number of communities and anchor institutions throughout parts of rural Maine, and places that are just really either unserved or underserved by critical middle mile infrastructure. In some places, it provides some redundancy for key infrastructure. In some places, it serves with middle mile for the first time and will allow last mile providers an affordable option to be able to connect to that. So thank you, Jenna, for putting the press release in there. I appreciate that. We are thrilled. We've been waiting for a very long time to hear about this project. It's a critical part of our infrastructure. If you looked at the broadband action plan, you'll see that middle mile is referenced in a lot of places. And as Brooke mentioned, having more affordable middle mile allows us to leverage those BEAD dollars to go much further. And so it really does change the landscape of how those last mile dollars will be spent. So we're over the moon with the announcement, and couldn't be happier. There'll be a lot more coming about it, but it's hot off the presses. So we just thanks to the Maine Broadband Coalition for the support and for the opportunity to just mention it at the top of the hour.
Yeah, it's really exciting. I don't fully comprehend what it means for the state. I don't have that type of 30,000 foot of knowledge, but I just know that it's a really good thing for us, and I'm excited to hear a little bit more about how it all factors into what we're doing here and the broadband action plan and all that.
So I just wanted to throw out, Joe, like I remember growing up, there was always this long debate that Maine needed an east-west highway, that we needed a highway that connected us from like maybe Canada or maybe Vermont, New Hampshire, that goes to Calais and the eastern border. And it was It would be a boondoggle project that we never needed, but we need the East-West Internet Highway, and we're actually going to get that. So this is really great for the state and for so many of your projects that are running through rural areas. Will make them a lot more competitive. So awesome news. Sorry, Joe. Proceed.
No, no worries. Yeah, I was just gonna maybe head it over to, I don't know if I know yesterday Tanya went first, I think, in the Reflect and Revise session. I don't know if that's gonna be the same course of action here today, but I was just gonna hand it right back over to the MCA folks to go through the broadband action plan and digital equity plans. So Tanya, take the floor.
Jenna's going to kick it off for us.
Jenna's kicking it off. Cool.
Yeah. Am I able to share my screen also right now without being a host?
Yeah, I should have
Okay,
given
cool.
you the ability to.
Okay, sweet. Let me just do that. Can you guys hear me all right too? I think yesterday I was having some audio issues.
You sound great.
Cool. All right, thank you. Okay. Yeah, so I am also slightly distracted. I'm thinking about middle mile, so I'm going to try to get through this quick and focus our attention back on BAP, the Broadband Action Plan, and Digital Equity Plan. And I'm just going to go through some intro slides and then, yeah, pass it over to Tanya and Maggie. And before I do that, my name is Jenna Ingram. I am the Accounts and Engagement Manager here at MCA. Maggie and Tanya, do you want to introduce yourselves quick right now?
Sure. Tanya Emery, Economic Development Director for MCA.
Hi, everyone. Maggie Drummond Ball. I'm the Strategic Partnership Director and have been leading the digital equity planning.
Thanks.
And
Yeah.
during our BAP presentation, we'll also be supported by Brooke Barron, and Brooke is here as well. Brooke, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hey, everybody. I'm a little slow on the unmute button today. For those I don't know, my name is Brooke Barron. I'm the NTIA Federal Program Officer here in Maine. So that means that I work for the U.S. Department of Commerce, the agency that is tasked by Congress with implementing the BEAD and digital equity programs. I think we have someone off mute. Thank you. And I live here in Harpswell. I'm here to be a support both to MCA and to all of you stakeholders. So I'll drop my contact information in the chat as well.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. All right. So just a little recap of the work to date in our stakeholder engagement that we did earlier this spring that many of you were participants in. So again, just thank you for being a part of that, and to just kind of like ground us again in what we're talking about today. So the purpose of the BAP and the digital equity plans are to prioritize strategies for broadband infrastructure deployment. That's also including things that support that deployment, like workforce programming. And then for the digital equity plan, it's to focus prioritization in the accessibility, adoption, and affordability of broadband. And that also includes supportive initiatives like digital skills training. I'm going to skip ahead to this and then come back. So the BAP and the digital equity plans are interrelated and also work as standalone plans. We chose to combine our digital equity and broadband deployment efforts in the broadband action plan. So the BAP includes many elements of the digital equity plan, and the digital equity plan also is a standalone document and is Maine's first statewide digital equity plan. So if you're interested in kind of the high level total picture of what we intend to do to address broadband infrastructure and digital equity, we would recommend that you can just look at the BAP and provide feedback on the BAP. If your work is really in the digital equity space and that is what you're touching through work, through an organization that you're working with, or in your own life, then we would recommend really doing a deep dive there and also providing feedback on that plan. Just going back to our timeline, as I mentioned, we had this engagement period in the spring. Then Maggie and Tanya worked to draft the two plans. And again, they are still in the draft stage right now. And then for the month of June, we are reflecting and revising on those 2 draft plans. We are having this feedback period to make sure that everything that we heard in the engagement period and all the information that we collected is being represented accurately. So once we kind of go through this, then we'll revise the plans as needed and submit them as the initial proposal back to NTIA in August. All right, so the reflect and revise process, what we're doing here today and what we're doing across the month of June. So again, following that engagement period and drafting period, we want to hear from you all to make sure that everything is accurately represented. The draft plans are on our website, on our planning page that you can look at if you haven't had the chance to do that yet, but we do hope to get your feedback today. And again, these are draft plans, so you might see some minor errors, but what we're really looking for feedback on is substantive things, so the actual content in there. Besides listening sessions like we're doing today, kind of the main way that we are getting feedback is using a Google form. There are sections that break down both the BAP and the digital equity plan in that form. If there is an area that you want to provide feedback on that doesn't have a specific section broken out, there's also a general feedback field at the end of the form that you can add any thoughts in there or email that feedback to bap@mainconnectivity.org. We would just ask that you let us know whether you're commenting on the BAP or digital equity plan if you email us. And both in the form and of course, if you email us, we will have your email address. We are just asking for that because as part of the BEAD requirements, we have to acknowledge that feedback and let you know how it was addressed in this revision process. Right, so again, besides the form, we're doing some listening sessions like this one. There's also some like true public open to anyone virtual sessions. And then June 30th, we have a hybrid session in Machias, and you could also join virtually. We have translated the executive summary and feedback form. The translations just got into my inbox this morning. So if you or anyone that you're working with needs translations of those of the plan, of that part of the plan or the form, you can reach out to us and we can provide that to you. You could also ask for any of these, either the English version or these other versions in print if you need it, and we could work through that too. All right, so some ground rules for today. Similar to the form, we're going to go through the sections that we're specifically looking for some feedback on. We are going to ask that you try to speak once per section because there is 20 of us in this call right now. We want to try to just be fair to everyone, make sure we hear from everyone. If there's anything that you either don't have the chance to talk about or you remember later, please, again, feel free to use the form or email bap@mainconnectivity.org. And we are not going to have answers for any feedback today. We're really just here to listen. So you might have questions and it might be tempting to get into conversation about some points, but we really just want to be capturing that feedback and again, using it in the revision process, and you will hear where that feedback ends up. Okay, yeah, there's a lot to cover. Again, feel free to email us if you don't get your feedback to us in this session. And we appreciate your candid feedback. We really want this to be a meaningful comment period. It's not just meant to check a box. So yeah, be candid. We look forward to it and we'll get started.
Thank you, Jenna. I'm going to walk through the sections of the Broadband Action Plan. We have highlighted sections that we think are particularly significant and substantive and worthy of having an opportunity to pause and ask for your feedback on. Of course, if there are other sections you want to give feedback on, please send an email or use the feedback form. Next slide. The executive summary. So this is our opportunity to sort of pull everything together and give you a shorter version. We know that the plan is beefy. We spent a lot of time writing it, so we are certainly well aware of how long it is. The executive summary is a shorter opportunity to give somebody a digestible version of the plan. Does it give people an opportunity to see the important themes and ideas that are addressed in the complete plan? This is a question that you might consider when you're reading it. It's also a nice synopsis if you were sort of sharing it with a stakeholder or someone. So we wanted to just pause for a second and ask for your feedback. When you read the plan and you looked at the executive summary, did you walk away thinking, you know what, that's a good summary. I feel like I could take that and share it with a friend or colleague who had not read the entire plan, and they'd have a pretty good sense of what the Broadband Action Plan we're just talking about the Broadband Action Plan right now, of what the BAP is about. Great. Elaine says yes in the chat. Awesome. And if there's no feedback or comments, if you don't feel like you need to comment, that's cool. We'll go right forward to the next one and we'll spend our time on the ones that you feel like we want to discuss. All right. Seeing no need to debate this one. Next slide, please. Thank you. Section 2 is an overview. And just so you know, these sections are sections that are in an NTIA template. We use the majority of the sections in the template, not all of them, but that structure is so that NTIA can find what they're looking for when they're looking at the elements of our plan. Section 2 is the overview. And this one in particular is the vision. So we set out to create a vision that was something that everybody could get behind. And so we would like you to look at that vision and think about, is there anything missing that you think would be important to add, or is there anything you disagree with? And the vision that we came up with is that the vision of the MCA is for a statewide connectivity infrastructure that will improve the lives of Mainers now and in the future, empowering broad participation in modern society. Any feedback that folks would like to offer on that? Seeing no takers, we'll move to the next slide. Next is goals and objectives. So we've laid out 6 strategic goals, and you'll notice that these become a theme throughout the Broadband Action Plan. Prioritizing funding to maximize impact. And here we're really talking for the first time about sort of a Venn diagram, which actually we received some great feedback yesterday in the sessions that we've done. We've got a Venn diagram that we've used in the plan, and we're going to call that out, balancing urgency, universality, and equity. And really where those intersect, that's really the sweet spot of projects that are going to sort of rise to the top and be prioritized. Now, we have an obligation under BEAD, under the program requirements, to prioritize folks that have no service. So people that are currently in the data at a service level of 25/3 or less. So we know that we need to get service to those people. But when we're looking at the service of, okay, who's going to get first priority? And also, as we are looking at, we have a plan to serve everybody that is unserved. We are also able to serve underserved individuals, locations, I'm sorry. We are able to serve them as long as we have a plan. We are going to be looking at these 3 factors: urgency, universality, and equity. That's where that digital equity piece from the digital equity plan really starts to factor in for the first time, and how MCA is looking at factoring digital equity into infrastructure and funding decisions. Second strategic goal, driving investments as a comprehensive portfolio. Third, optimizing broadband deployment. And that's where we talk a lot about removing some of those barriers that have been very challenging. Industry providers in particular were very vocal about some of those obstacles. We also heard a lot from communities about the obstacles, things like the challenges with buds and financing. Strategic goal 4, expanding and enhancing the foundation for digital equity. The ecosystem has been a few really key, strong organizations and individuals doing great work. But Maggie's laid out an amazing sort of complete ecosystem and laid out a vision to fill in all those gaps with funding, with the materials to really pull it all together and create an ecosystem that will last. Strategic goal number 5 is a focus on affordability, because we heard loud and clear from so many people in the communities that is a struggle. And goal number 6 is raising awareness and strengthening feedback loops. So we'd like to pause here and ask folks, when you hear these strategic goals, are there goals or objectives that might be missing from this plan? Are there any that you would change? Are there any that you would add? And are there any that you would remove that you don't agree are a priority, that you don't think should be listed as a priority in the action plan?
I heard just a little bit in there about the 25-3 versus the 100. Can you just repeat that part again, just on where we're emphasizing, like, you know, what's top priority, what's next, et cetera, just because it got a little bit confusing to me in that.
So the BEAD program requires that we make it a priority to first deliver service to everyone who is unserved. And their definition, the NTIA definition in the BEAD program of unserved, is people who, locations that do not have service at a level of 25/3. So they may have service. I'm sorry.
What technology, via which technologies, Tanya? And I'm specifically, I think there are two things at 25-3 that we have to just quickly understand as a group. And one is, what's the effect of any satellite, which I think is probably not counted. And then the one that is a little bit of concern, I think might be counted, is fixed terrestrial wireless. Is that counted? If you can receive 25-3 via fixed terrestrial wireless, does it count against you?
Okay, so it sounds like what I'm hearing is that we need a little bit more of a primer as to the rules and regulations of BEAD funding in the plan.
Or just some clarity on some of that definition, because it has shifted over time a little bit, I think. And it is
Just to be clear, Joe, this is the BEAD definition. So that definition has not shifted. It has never existed before. So there's been a state definition. We will provide that state definition earlier and make it more clear in the plan. So it provides that clarity for reference throughout the plan.
Thank you.
Yes.
And so
could I
just
follow? Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Tanya, so yes or no, if you receive 25-3 and it's via fixed terrestrial wireless, ineligible for?
We are not going to answer all the questions today. We can do a deep dive into all the program rules, but if we start doing all the answers, we are not going to get through all the questions today. We will do a deep dive and do FAQs on the website. Charlie, did you have another question?
It's probably too down in the weeds, but I just wanted to follow up on that just a little bit, talking about 25-3, and you know that's the current standard, which is obviously, as we all know, outdated. Do we say something of we will, you know, I know this is coming out of the BEAD program, but do we say we will follow whatever federal definition for unserved is? Let's say the unserved limit does actually at the federal level become 100/20. You know, are we being so literal here that we're saying it's going to be 25-3 for this, regardless of whether the federal standard changes?
That's interesting.
Okay. Any other comments on the strategic goals? Are there any that
I've got one, Tanya.
Sure, thanks.
So I see the focus on affordability, and when you get into the details, it's a lot about subsidies, frankly, from the federal government or potential other, tax-based subsidies. I'd like to see the state be more aggressive on using its leverage and using its power in the market to create affordability opportunities through our existing providers. And there are some ways that could happen, especially with the MooseNet project now, that we may be owning and operating as a state some middle mile infrastructure that could be leveraged to keep prices down on the supply side, where we know these companies are very profitable on their internet business lines. And we want to serve Mainers with this publicly funded infrastructure. So I encourage the plan to integrate some more of those ideas rather than just subsidizing subscribers at the prices that that the subscribers can get.
Thank you. Anybody else about the goals?
Yes, this is Mary Beth Allen. I'm from the Orland Broadband Committee. And I would just speak again to the previous comment about clarifying the eligibility standards. I know you talked about clarifying the definitions for no connection and unconnection. We also have in our committee are confused about the mapping data that is talked about. There's the FCC map, there's the MCA map. I'm hoping that in the final guidelines, you can be more clear as to which location map is going to be used to define the connected, no connected, underserved, and unserved.
Yes, we can do that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
We are expecting another data release we got a data release at the end of the last month, and we are expecting further data. It's being updated constantly. Brooke is answering some of these questions in the chat so as to not slow down our conversation, but also to give you guys some of the questions about what NTIA's rules and regulations are, as NTIA is the authority on those rules and regulations. Next slide. Section 3 is about the current state of broadband deployment. So this is where we're required to answer some of the questions about what are our current programs and partnerships and assets. The asset inventory in particular is more fully explored in the DE plan. And so we've got some cross-referencing between the two documents here. So the questions that we might ask you to consider here: what programs, partnerships, or assets are missing from this plan? Are there any that you would remove? So does anybody have feedback on Section 3, existing programs, partnerships, or the asset inventory? Seeing none, next slide, please. Section 3.4 is needs and gaps assessment. So this is where we look at these categories and think about what do we have, where do we want to be, and what are we missing? Service availability, extremely high cost locations. So the NTIA has determined that under the BEAD program, there will be the ability to determine a threshold, and locations that are above that threshold that cannot be reasonably served. Say, for example, a location that is on an island, 30 miles off the coast of Maine cannot be reasonably served with fiber, or something that's 10 miles down a dirt road that's an individual location may not be able to be reasonably served by cost effectively. That may meet that high cost location threshold and may qualify for alternative technologies. And so because of that, there's this extremely high cost location provision in the legislation. Community anchor institutions, affordability, digital equity. Again, this is a place where we have some of that cross-referencing back and forth between the digital equity plan. Workforce, this is sort of one of the first places that we really see a lot of content about the workforce plan, which we did an analysis with Camoin Associates early on, looking at the workforce that was necessary to deploy and maintain this amount of infrastructure, and also to continue to service it on an ongoing basis. And also the policy and regulatory environment, which the MBC's policy committee was very helpful in helping us to understand an inventory, looking at issues of affordability, digital equity, infrastructure projects, publicly owned infrastructure, which we know has been a real hot button issue, and policies to address barriers to broadband deployment. So are there any needs and gaps that might be missing from the plan that stood out to you? Are there any that you might change? And are there any that you would remove? Seeing no takers on this one, we'd move to the next slide, please, Jenna. Section 4, obstacles and barriers. Now there's significant overlap with section 5.4, which is the strategies. So I've combined them into one slide just to not duplicate. Strategy 1, prioritize funding to maximize impact. And that's where we talk again about balancing urgency, universality, and equity. Strategy 2, I'm not going to read them because I read them once before. So if anybody has feedback on these, raise your hand or forever hold your peace. Any obstacles or barriers that we have not identified? I think this is a really important one for this group in particular. And if you have not identified it to have this conversation, we would certainly love for you to use the Google form or send an email to the bab@mainconnectivity.org email. We would love to have your feedback, because as folks working in this space, you have had the opportunity to identify obstacles and barriers firsthand. So we would certainly welcome your feedback if there's something that you've identified that we have not inventoried. Next slide, Jenna. Section 5, implementation plan. So the first thing we did was lay out some priorities in terms of how we are going to lay out the activities that will be funded. That really is a significant piece of the work in this action plan. The priorities that we've identified are to expand a data-driven and transparent approach, laying out the data that we're using to make decisions and giving people access to that information and data. For example, having access to that location data and analysis, understanding where the data comes from, being transparent with systems and information and process, growing and strengthening the ecosystem, leveraging networks of opportunity. So rather than creating new systems, looking at networks, for example, networks that support some of the covered populations that are important audiences for digital equity services. Let's look at who are the networks that are already supporting those populations, and let's support their work because they're already in touch with those important audiences, and let's lift them up to continue their capacity so that they can do that work. Get creative, leverage existing assets, removing systemic barriers and shouting it from the rooftops, doing that storytelling work. We still have a significant number of people in the state of Maine that are not interested in broadband, that don't see the importance of being connected, and in some places are skeptical or downright scared. And so there is a significant amount of education and opportunity to help people see, and they may be convinced by seeing how it benefits someone else that looks like them, some of their peers, rather than a government agency telling them why they should or what the benefits are. And so those storytelling campaigns can be much more compelling than somebody at a town meeting saying, here's all the pros and cons of why you should get this service. So these are some of the priorities that we've identified that have helped us shape our implementation plan. Questions to consider: do you agree with these priorities for implementation? Are there any that you would add or change? Seeing no one, question in the chat. It is, guys, it's hard for me to read the questions in the chat and address them rather than to have them brought up. So are there any phases of this work encouraging competition? Cost of access is a barrier. I'm going to let my colleagues handle the chat, and I'm going to continue to work on people that are raising their hands. And if other MCA folks can address the chat questions, that would be most helpful just to keep us moving. Next slide, please, Jenna. My challenge here was to just find the tiniest font I could possibly find to make this slide have the most content of any slide I've ever produced in my life. And I think it succeeded. So this is the actual implementation plan where we've talked about the activities that we imagine funding with the BEAD funding, and they're broken down by strategy. So this is a lot of content. There are a lot of activities that we imagine funding, but I think it's really important that people think about, when you think about the state of Maine receiving somewhere between $200 and $300 million, we think it might be somewhere in the neighborhood of 235-ish million. We'll find out more in the next 15 days to fund infrastructure, and it has to follow BEAD regulations. It's not just going to fund whatever we want it to. These are the things that we anticipate funding. These are what we think are going to be the things that are going to move the needle. If you think something should be on this list and it's not here, now is the time to bring it up. The time to bring it up is not 6 months after we've received the grant funding. The time to bring it up is now. And so if you have been thinking to yourself, what would really work well, it would be amazing to hear that from you guys now. We imagine that some of the things under prioritizing funding to maximize impact, the connectivity hubs model, alternative strategies for those extremely high cost locations, looking at different technologies I know some of you have had the opportunity to work with Chris Bonikowski, who's our broadband infrastructure director. You know, some of the newer technologies are much more sophisticated than what they used to be. And I know some of us are like, hey, I don't know about that. There are a lot of new ways to deliver service that are great options for some of those extremely high cost unserved locations. And so he's really encouraging us to think differently about how we might deliver some of those services to those high cost unserved locations. Looking at that state agency team that's coordinating broadband implementation across state agencies and infrastructure projects and deployment. Driving investments as a comprehensive portfolio, looking at how we use our data across this system that we're calling CHART, where we've got an incredible wealth of data and an incredible team, Megan, to analyze it. Let's use it for good, and let's leverage the power of that and use it transparently to allow all of you to see that data and to access it, to build projects and to say, okay, how do we use this for our region? To work with our partners in regions to be able to build projects that will also benefit communities next to you, and to maximize how we leverage these resources. Inviting proposals on a rolling basis. Things like not having one deadline per half a year or a quarter or something. Instead, doing it on a rolling basis and not having a rush to deadline. That's something that is a significant change, but also allows folks to get a proposal ready and work with the staff and work with a service provider and get to the point where it's ready and bring it forward, and allows us to be part of helping to prepare the deal, get it to the point where it's ready, and then launch it. Miles.
Thanks, Tanya. Yeah, the data sharing would be great. I think the market and users of these services would benefit greatly from as much data being shared as possible, and maybe as the funding agency leveraging your market power to force the providers to provide more information about where they're serving as transparently as possible would be beneficial. Some of our providers are fairly transparent about where they're going to build next, and some of them are not, and some are giving us maps on where they provide service and some of them don't. So anything you can do in that area, I think, would be beneficial. In terms, again, on the affordability part, I'd like to see the state go harder on accountability on the supply side, and how can we use the leverage that we do have to, kind of to Ruben's point too, make sure that we're getting quality service, we're getting accountability, that this endeavor is going to put a lot of Mainers into a situation where they only have one broadband provider in the future, and maybe it's a fiber provider, and that's awesome and a better situation than they're in now, but they're still in a monopoly situation, and their only hope for having some leverage in that situation is if the state is as aggressive as it can possibly be to make sure that they're protected as the consumer in that situation. So I'd like to see more of that in the plan. The only other thing I would add too is the internet safety stuff. There's a lot of international organizations who've done a lot of awesome work on internet safety, and I hope we just don't reinvent the wheel there. There's just great resources out there and great organizations doing this, mostly internationally, and I've done some of this work myself that we may be able to bring in and kind of localize it for Maine in particular. But lots of good stuff out there, and we should use it whenever possible.
Awesome. That's great feedback. Thank you very much. Anybody else have feedback on activities in the implementation plan? Bob.
Hi. When I look at the planning activity strategy 1, and I see maximize impact. Well, maximizing impact, that's kind of a nebulous term, and balancing urgency, that's kind of a nebulous term, and universality could mean different things, and so can equity, depending on how you define these things. The incumbent ISPs have already tried to maximize impact. Their maximization of impact is to get a better ROI for themselves. I don't know what balancing urgency is. I can tell you what it means for me. Balancing urgency means I've got to get my program up and running because my member towns may say, hey, wait a second, you guys are moving too slow. You're not moving fast enough. We've got to start stringing wire and getting something done. Universality, does that mean everyone in a particular area gets served? Or does that mean that the ISP cannot come in and do what they want, and if they don't serve everybody, well, you know, that's the breaks of the game. So, and then I also had a question about the chart, and I don't know if this is the right place to ask it, but is the chart, it's an analysis, research, and transparency. Is that going to take the place of the LMIGC when you guys are looking through applications to try to determine who gets it? And if so, then I guess the chart becomes a place where everything comes together and gets scored. Is that a correct assumption?
Yes, it's essentially pulling together the data sources that we're already using under one umbrella and not creating a new system, but yes, using the data that we already have and using it in a more comprehensive way. Yes.
And is that going to take the place of the last mile internet grant committee?
It's not taking the place of a committee, it's a data system. It's not taking the place of people.
So it's an algorithm?
It's a tool. It's a tool. It still has to be used by people, but it's a tool to be used by people.
It'll be used by people, not artificial intelligence.
Yes.
All right. That's what I thought. Anyhow.
Other feedback on activities? Okay, I want to make sure I give Maggie, I think this is my last slide. Jenna, can you move forward? Yes, it is. Okay, I want to make sure we give Maggie time. So if anybody has other feedback about activities under the Broadband Action Plan, we would love to hear from you. And now it is Maggie's turn.
I will be fast and try to make plenty of space for folks to chime in, and do keep using the chat. And Miles and Joe, I assume we'll get a copy of the chat comments too, so we can integrate them. Okay, great. Thank you. So as Tanya mentioned, the Digital Equity Plan is a standalone document, but it is also integrated into the Broadband Action Plan. So you will see a lot of common threads. And I think one of the ways that we differentiate between the two is that the Digital Equity Plan goes into much greater detail about how we will maximize the impact of our infrastructure investment to drive adoption and ensure affordability, and goes into much less detail about the infrastructure deployment side of our work, and doesn't say really much at all about workforce, which is all in the Broadband Action Plan. I should make it clear, because it's been clear throughout the listening sessions this week. This is a separate source of funding. So that's why we are required by NTIA to create two plans. There is a digital equity funding source through the Digital Equity Act that is going to allow us to implement what's in this digital equity plan. It is different than our BEAD allocation. So the executive summary, jumping into the first section here, as Tanya mentioned, what we're really looking for here in terms of feedback is ensuring that the executive summary of each of these plans can be a standalone document that covers just enough to give folks an idea of what's in the plan and to give them the high points. So we're interested in ensuring we have covered enough here without going into too much detail to give people that big picture. Love your feedback on that. And then we also are very specifically looking for suggestions for a different way to talk about what the NTIA has called covered populations. And the Digital Equity Act tells all of the states There are 8 covered populations we know are impacted by the digital divide, and your plan must address each of them very specifically, as well as the general public. So the covered populations, as a phrase, we don't love it. We feel like it sort of dehumanizes people a little bit. So we would encourage suggestions for other ways we could talk about these kind of key audiences that are addressed in our digital equity plan. Okay.
Something like covered stakeholders or covered residents. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
The 93%.
Yeah, the 89%, I think, is the official.
89, is that what it is? Okay.
The 89%. Okay.
Certainly not the other half.
Yeah. Okay, helpful. For folks who haven't chimed in, we do encourage you to keep putting comments in the chat. Maybe we'll come up with something brilliant today. Okay, next slide, Jenna. So we did create a separate, although complementary vision for the digital equity plan. It echoes a lot of what you see in the broadband action plan, but we go into a little more detail about those specific elements of digital inclusion, and are interested in folks' feedback on whether this vision, captures where we want to go, if there are things that we should add, or anything that folks disagree with in the vision for digital equity. Until everybody just got so blown away by Tanya and the broadband action plan that they have nothing left. All right, let's go to the next slide. The way that we have talked about these will look very familiar. The way we've talked about these values in the broadband action plan as a whole are kind of as priorities. And yes, we will share the slide deck, and it will be on our website as well for folks to use. The way we're thinking about these values is that there may be moments, where we have to make hard decisions, and we sort of wanted to have some touch points in our digital equity work to say, what do we need to keep in mind as we make this decision? Is this a decision that's going to help us leverage some of the networks of opportunity that we have? Are we finding partners that are led by folks who are most impacted by the digital divide? Are we erring on the side of sort of strengthening the ecosystem of partners? Are we making a decision based on the data? So we're really thinking of these as a sort of guiding values for our digital equity work. Charlie, definitely, we had a hard time kind of balancing content on these slides. So anything that you're not able to follow in this presentation, we do really encourage you to go look at the plan and use that feedback form to the extent that it's hard to do it in this kind of setting. And so what we're looking for here is really if there are other values that we should be adding in to this list or considering to help guide the way we do our digital equity work, the way we implement our plan. Okay, next slide, Jenna. This next section around alignment with existing efforts, it really outlines the ways that we considered and looked at local digital equity plans, the regional and tribal digital equity plans, and also so thinking about how those are incorporated into our state digital equity plan, and then also describing some of the state's other goals that our digital inclusion work can help contribute to. So we've identified some key areas here that we think the digital inclusion work can contribute, and that's in our workforce and economic development, educational attainment, healthy aging, and telehealth, where it seemed like those were areas where we had clear state goals, and there was a direct connection to our digital equity work to help enable accomplishing those goals. So in this section, we're really looking for additional kind of state goals that might be that our digital inclusion work can help contribute to, anything that we haven't mentioned. And of course, we welcome links and specifics. Miles, is your hand raised or is that old?
Yeah.
Okay.
Nope. New hand.
Great.
Yeah. I don't know where to put this exactly, and I don't know that it is as high priority as other things, but you know, we're bringing people, particularly in very rural areas, onto the internet, and like bridging the digital divide by addressing their access and their ability to afford connection, and et cetera, but once they get there, they face very different things, particularly if they're in a rural area. And I'm thinking particularly of like e-government, local government services. Your town doesn't have a website. Your town manager may not have an email address. And in a slightly different way, like you might not have a local newspaper that is online at all. There may not be any information coverage of your town that's trustworthy and viable. I've seen sort of the local media movement in the US push for BEAD funding to be used to support these types of things, like information in rural news deserts, or for populations who can't get news and information in their own language. I don't know necessarily that this is the perfect way to fit it in, but it might be. And I get the sense through these plans that you guys are putting a lot of stuff out there so that you have flexibility later if that's what you decide to do to solve these problems. And those might be some tools that you could put on the table and decide if they're valuable later. Just a thought. We'll put it in writing when we submit our written feedback. But
thank you. Yeah, and that is sounds like it would be potentially some activities under one of the strategies. So when we get into these strategies, that is probably where you would provide that suggestion.
Yeah.
Okay, helpful. Jenna, can you go to the next slide? And I can see we have like 5 minutes left, and I know we may lose some folks, and I'm sorry this is taking so long. There are kind of, there's a section, this section that we're looking at, kind of a continuation of the alignment with other existing efforts. NTIA has really asked the states to think about what are some of the other complementary funding sources that will support your digital equity goals and your plans. So we have outlined some of the ways that these other funding sources will complement the digital equity funding that we'll receive. We should note that we do make it very clear in this plan that everything we've proposed here is going to take more resources, and I'll talk more about that in our strategy section. But one of the things we talk about in this section is raising a digital equity fund that will allow us to fully implement these measures. So what we're looking for here is other funding sources, that any kind of funding sources that may help contribute to our digital inclusion work in Maine.
So, yeah, so I don't know, we've been trying to find money, and we've gone through the Northern Border grants, a bunch of USDA applications, congressional directed spending, and asking for funds there, the Northern Border grants and the USDA for getting any kind of significant money from them puts us in the same problem we're at right now, because they require matching funds. So, you know, those are other sources of funds. They're not easy to get, and they require a lot of work preparing grant applications, but there are other sources of funds.
Yeah, thank you for that. We do mention in here, there's a congressionally directed spending request for the library system in Maine that we think is critical to accomplishing our digital equity work, but there could be others that we haven't identified, and Northern Border Regional Commission I don't think is mentioned in this section, so good to note that. All right, next slide, Jenna. Okay, quick note here, these are there are 3 different places in the digital equity plan where we talk about the strategies, and in the executive summary we talk about them very briefly, like headlines. As we get into the strategy and objective session, we talk about them in sort of paragraph form. And then when we get to section 5, we talk about them in great detail with the activities listed under each one. So just alerting folks that that's kind of the flow of how they're reflected in the plan. In this section, we are looking at creating a foundation for digital equity. So really thinking through what are those core elements that we need to have in place to advance digital equity in Maine. And it includes things like getting our asset inventory as an online tool so people can find it, and having a digital equity manager at MCA to help support all this work. Strategy 2 is about really thinking through some of those core assets that we have and how are we going to work with those partners to reach the people who are most impacted by the digital divide, and to reach all the places geographically in Maine, specifically with our digital inclusion programming. And the question related to strategy 2, if you go in the plan and you can look at that in great detail, we are asking folks to weigh in on how we prioritize the funding for those different types of partners that are there. Strategy 3 is really a focus on affordability. So you'll hear this is a common theme in the BAP and the digital equity plan. It's a critical issue in Maine. And there's a lot of different strategies here, including really leveraging the Affordable Connectivity Program, but also exploring some of the ways that we can have a state equivalent of the ACP, and ways that we can really look at some of the local models that we're seeing emerging as well, and policy fixes. Then we've got some statewide education and information campaigns. This is where we're trying to articulate how we think the state's role is a little bit different than our other partners who are doing on the ground digital inclusion work. For example, a statewide device refurbishment campaign, and that internet safety campaign, where we're really trying to create a framework that lots of partners can take advantage of as we spread this information to the folks who need to have it. And then lastly, as I mentioned, additional funding we think is really critical. So that last strategy is about raising the funds we need to do this work in Maine. Charlie and Miles, I can't tell if that's a new hand, but I'll call on Charlie first.
Yeah, just considering your question to consider on strategy 2, it seems to me, you know, what do you suggest we prioritize funding for first? Depending on where you are, what you prioritize within the state, and we're such a reasonably geographically diverse state, that what you prioritize out west somewhere is not going to be what you're going to be prioritizing along the coast. So I'm raising that as an issue. I don't know that there's a question or an answer to it, but I'm just raising it as an issue.
Yeah. So you'll see when you go to that section, there are kind of 3 ways that we're thinking about this. There's sort of core digital inclusion partners. There are partners that are working at the regional scale with lots of folks within the regions. And then there are those kind of networks of organizations that are directly working with the covered populations on potentially other things. So that's where we want you to weigh in on the prioritization. And I definitely think that as we are thinking about funding and supporting different regional partners, their plans are different and do have
Okay.
different strategies included. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I should say in the appendix, you can see all of the regional plans that were developed to contribute to this state plan. So do check out the appendix. Jenna, let's move on to the next slide.
I wasn't sure, Bob, if you had feedback here. Oh, I just saw you were unmuted. Maybe not.
I'm just unmuted, sorry.
Okay, cool.
So you can be quick on the draw. Okay, so in this section, one of the other things that NTIA asks us to do, and all of the states are working really hard at this, is trying to figure out what are the measurable objectives that we can achieve towards our goals. So there are two things to look at here. One is in this section, we within each of these objectives try to lay out a way that a goal that we want to achieve and a way that we're going to measure it. And these are all the elements of digital inclusion outlined in our plan. And then in the appendix, there's also sort of an accompanying memo that describes the data that we have and the data that we're using and some of the data that we don't have and how we might address that moving forward. So the questions here are really, should there be different goals? Are there other ways of measuring this impact? Are there goals that are not addressed, goals other than these digital inclusion elements, or any goals here that we should take out? Okay. I know we're losing folks.
Sorry, Maggie. This is really helpful. I was happy to see more specific metrics in this section, and it actually made me reflect that I didn't see as much on the broadband action plan and would like to see the same thing there. Like, what are the metrics for success, which if we achieve those, is it 99% coverage of unserved locations with service meeting Maine's definition? Is that success? That kind of thing would be awesome to see on the other plan as well.
Okay. All right. Next slide. This next section of the plan really details our assets. So we wanted to figure out what are the assets we have to work from, what are the things that are going to help us achieve our goals in Maine. The initial draft of our digital equity asset inventory was done by the University of Maine. You can find all of the assets they cataloged here, both general assets and those that are supporting the specific covered populations. And the next phase of our asset inventory, which will be an online tool, is also going to include all those assets that were identified by our regional partners that are not reflected in the University of Maine report. So this section is going to expand a little bit. So we are interested in additional assets that are not identified in this section, partners, networks, programs, initiatives that can help us achieve our digital equity work. Okay. We've got 3 more slides and I know we're losing people, so I'll try to go through these pretty quickly and invite folks to use the feedback form. The next section of the report is really to look at the barriers. So this is a section you want to read closely to ensure that we haven't missed any barriers to adoption. This section outlines both general barriers faced by everybody in Maine, and the ways in which barriers are exacerbated for the covered populations. And we also identify some very unique barriers for various covered populations. And we ask folks to please let us know what we have missed in this section. And it's particularly helpful if you identify as any of those covered populations and can look at that section about that specific covered population and reflect on it from your personal experience.
I just have a question, and not really like a piece of commentary necessarily to offer here, but I'm just curious if you're pushing this section back out through the same channels that you gather that information from those specific covered. Okay, that's what I assumed. You guys are on top of it. I was just checking.
Yeah. All right, let's go to the next one. All right, this is a meaty one. So this section of the plan really builds on what we learned in the asset section, what we learned in the barrier section, and it's basically the synthesis. So given everything we've learned about our what we're building from and the barriers we're facing, what are those needs that we're identifying? So certainly a great need for more awareness of ACP and more tools to help drive affordability, more places, particularly for the covered populations, to go where they can get technical support and digital skills training, more access to affordable devices and particularly paired with technical support. And definitely significant need around just education and support on internet safety, which was an area that was pretty consistent throughout the outreach process. And we also identify a need to do a sort of user-centered audit of a lot of our state agency online tools to really understand what's accessible and inclusive and how can we address some of the barriers there. So the question to all of you is, are there additional needs in the digital equity work in particular that are not noted in this section? Okay. Definitely a meaty section to read through. If you haven't read it in great detail, welcome folks to do that. The next section describes two things, both the outreach and engagement process that we went through to create the plan, as well as the ways that we will work with partners and continue to collaborate in implementation of the plan. So what we'll look for in terms of feedback here is really who else can help us implement this work that are not mentioned here? What are some of the other partners we should be working with? And if, particularly if your organization is mentioned here, or you know of organizations that are mentioned here, does the role that we've described for them make sense? And what else can we be doing to ensure that we're all collaborating together to implement this plan? Okay, I think the next slide is my last one, Joe, and then we'll hand it to you. And Jenna, I'm realizing we neglected yesterday to add a new slide here to outline the timeline. So I'll say a few words about the timeline and then we'll add that slide for our next time we do this. This last section, if you read no other sections of the digital equity plan, this is the most important one to dig into. This is where we really get into the detail of the activities that we're proposing under those 5 big strategies. And this is where we could use your feedback. Specifically, are these the right big strategies? And then are these the right activities within each of those strategies? Are there things that are missing? Are there things that we should be adding? And we have talked about the strategies multiple times, so I'm guessing folks have probably given feedback and I'll ask you to drop it in the chat and just say a couple words about the timeline. The timing right now for the states to potentially receive implementation funding for this work is looking like the middle of 2024, so about a year from now. But you'll see in the timeline for the digital equity plan that we are proposing to begin implementing right away. And we're doing that through our partnerships with the regional and tribal partners and the existing funding that we have for that program this year and next year. So what we hope is then we'll be able to significantly expand going into the second half of 2024 and then in earnest in 2025. The other things you'll notice in the timeline in the plan are that we will do an interim evaluation in 2027 and then sort of a final measurement of impact in 2030. And there are a lot of tools that we propose to implement right away, including getting that internet safety campaign up and running, getting the device donation campaign going, getting the asset inventory online so folks can find the resources they need. But would welcome folks weighing in on the timeline as well as the strategies and activities. And Joe and Miles, thank you so much for giving us this time with folks to gather feedback in this forum.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you guys put in a ton of work for these plans, so it's really good to have you here and hearing feedback from this group in particular, because this group shares its opinion frequently, and it's always great. So I will. I'm trying to think about this. I'm gonna send an email to everyone who's here, and then maybe I'll just send it out to everybody who usually comes to West Hawk Broadbands with the PowerPoint presentation and the recording from today. I'll send you guys the recording and text from the chat, and I'll also include MooseNet presentation that Tanya offered to send me, so that everybody can get up to speed on that as well. But yeah, it's 12:15 and it's sunny, and I'm gonna go for a walk in the neighborhood. So thank you everybody
It's
for
Friday.
coming. I'll see you next Friday. Yeah, it's Friday. Cool. And a long weekend.
Thank you, everybody, so
Beautiful.
much.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend.
Gotcha.
See you soon.